Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our first of 3 sessions, Exploring Our Vulnerable Democracy. And this program tonight is being recorded. Tonight's program explores recent events and their connection to the political upheaval that ended Reconstruction and biracial democracy in South Carolina in 1876. This program series is a partnership with Richland Library, the South Carolina State Museum, Historic Columbia, University of South Carolina Center for Civil Rights History and Research, Duquesne University, and the University of South Carolina Collaborative on Race. This evening's program is being recorded on Zoom and will be made available to anyone unable to attend tonight's session. The next 2 programs are Monday, May 3rd, led by Dr. Bobby Donaldson, and Monday, May 10th, led by Dr. Jennifer Gunter. If you have questions for Dr. Taylor during tonight's program, please type the questions into the question and answer section on the Zoom settings, and we will vet them and relay them to Dr. Taylor. The chat settings in tonight's program have been disabled otherwise. So in other words, you cannot message other attendees. Before we get started, I do want to introduce Dr. Jennifer Taylor. Dr. Taylor holds a PhD in US history from the University of South Carolina and a master's in US history from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Dr. Taylor is closely involved with Historic Columbia in transforming the Woodrow Wilson Family Home into the nation's first museum of Reconstruction. Jennifer specializes in public history and the tensions involved in public history commemorations and interpretation. Her recent scholarship explores the ways in which Reconstruction history has been contested and commemorated in South Carolina. Her current project traces the rebirth of the Woodrow Wilson Family Home as a modern historic house museum, using it, along with docent oral histories, as a lens to analyze white supremacy and contested history in museums and other public spaces. Jennifer is especially drawn to the history and design of exhibit film and public history settings. She explores this topic via the Museum of Reconstruction's exhibit films, which incorporate the birth of a nation, artistic responses to it, and locally archived moving images and photographs to discuss white supremacy and citizenship. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Taylor.
Thank you so much, James, for that warm introduction. We will be looking at a little bit of film today, but we're primarily going to be treating material culture or artifacts as we try to make some connections between Reconstruction and its demise and some of the events we've seen going on the last year or so, culminating with the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. So I'm going to do a screen share here. We'll have a little bit of PowerPoint. We'll also have some poll questions just to sort of interact and engage. They are all anonymous, so don't feel like anyone's judging you when they come up, and we'll share those together as a group. So give me one moment here and let me screen share and get this PowerPoint going. And we'll get started today. Let me move this bar so everybody can see. If you are a social media user, I am on Twitter and Instagram, so I welcome you to follow me there. Feel free to follow, ask follow-up questions. But I'm usually using a public history lens on this site, so I definitely welcome you to follow me on those sites. So today we'll be talking about From Red Shirts to Proud Boys, Museum Artifacts, White Domestic Terror, and Election Fraud. I'd like to start off by thanking Joanne Zeiss of the South Carolina State Museum for her guidance. We are not just using objects today from the Museum of the Reconstruction Era at the Woodrow Wilson Family Home. We are also using objects from the State Museum, as well as some objects on loan from other institutions. So thank you, Joanne, for all of your help preparing for this. I'd also like to thank Duquesne University, my university, where I'm assistant professor of public history, for sponsoring the series, and of course, Richland Library and the Collaborative on Race and the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. So just to add a little bit to what James said, I actually ended up writing the semi-guided tour for the tour of the Woodrow Wilson Family Home, which is now the Museum of the Reconstruction Era. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you today is based on my own personal experiences talking with the public about white supremacy, domestic terror, and paramilitary violence. And it's also informed by the interviews I did with docents about their experiences talking with the public as well. All right, so let's get started here. So here we have a couple of images that were certainly across newspapers in the days following the siege on the Capitol. So on January 13th, 2021, during a US House of Representatives debate impeaching President Donald Trump for an extraordinary second time, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi called the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th domestic terrorists. Thousands left Trump's fiery speech that morning, embracing his final words to, quote, walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, end quote, to give weak Republicans the encouragement needed to, quote, take back our country. Some protesters exited believing he was accompanying them. After all, he promised, I'll be there with you. A 2,000-person police force, most of whom lacked riot gear, unsuccessfully met the rally attendees turned insurrectionists who penetrated the legislative chambers to disrupt the official count of the electoral votes for President-elect Joe Biden. Paramilitary forces roamed a maze of hallways in search of Vice President Mike Pence and Speaker Pelosi. Among the weapons present that day were pipe bombs, zip ties, Molotov cocktails, and semi-automatic rifles. The mob, mostly unmasked due to COVID-19 conspiracy theories, stole electronics, trashed offices, and literally put their feet up, making themselves at home while members of Congress hid or fled for their lives. At the height of the violence, Capitol Police shot Ashley Babbitt as she attempted to breach the House chamber. Rioters bludgeoned Officer Brian D. Sicknick to death with a fire extinguisher. 2 other rioters died of separate medical emergencies, and a total of 5 people lost their lives as a result of the infamous day's events. To meet this moment and address the homegrown domestic terror on display January 6th, the United States will finally be forced to reconcile its long history of militant white supremacy. So how do we conduct this conversation? Well, I think material culture and artifacts from museums related to Reconstruction can help us better understand the larger paramilitary forces shaping modern white supremacy and right-wing militancy. These objects offer concrete examples from history that are recognizable to us as we try to think about things like the state response to this kind of violence as well. So we're gonna have a poll, our first poll here. And this is anonymous and you can only choose one. So this was the first question that I asked on the front porch of the Museum of Reconstruction at the Woodrow Wilson Family Home. And it allowed me to gauge where sort of people were in Reconstruction narrative. So I want to use it with you all today as well. So I'll give you a moment to take this poll. Almost everyone there. Give just a few more seconds here. See what we got in the chat here, just as we're doing this. Oh, nice. Thanks, guys, for joining us. All right, I haven't seen a new vote here in about 15 seconds. Oh, there's one. Come on, if you're one of the 6 that snuck off to make a bowl of cereal or a snack for this talk, come on back and take our poll. All right, I'm gonna end it now. And I'm gonna share this with you so you can see what your peers thought as well. So a lot of you, right, recognize this is the period following the Civil War. And I think a lot of people do. But sometimes that's really the limit of what people know. I'm actually really, really proud of you all because no one marked carpetbaggers. And I can tell you, hands down, that's what I saw the most of when I would ask someone, like, this derogatory term has infiltrated so much of our conversation and our dialogue about Reconstruction, it becomes a popular response. But we can see, I think, some of the positive things of Reconstruction that didn't always make it into our narratives as kids and growing up, like our first attempt at a biracial democracy. In fact, that is how I define Reconstruction, as the period following the Civil War, where we did attempt a biracial democracy and move towards a total wage labor system in this country. But this language of radical Republicans, military occupation, how it ends with domestic terror, and of course, the greatest gift that the Reconstruction era, I would argue, probably gave us, other than freedom and expanding the right to vote, was access to public education. So you all are very much in the know, and that makes me happy that carpetbaggers is not your main answer, but for a lot of folks it is. And you can imagine that's why we have some of these documents and these artifacts related to that in the home. Here you can see an authentic carpet bag. And I also want to take a moment to introduce you to Thomas Nast, who will be looking at some of his cartoons today. This is his famous carpetbagger, the man with the carpet bags from 1872. So I'd like you to just take a moment here and look at this next cartoon by Thomas Nast. We can see a really early use of the lost cause as a phrase, right? This idea that the Civil War was fought not because of slavery, but because of states' rights, and that everybody fought bravely and for honor. And of course, we know that slavery is the primary reason that the Civil War is fought. But it takes a long time to cement that narrative. And when you end up defining the lost cause in this way, it also allows you to ignore the domestic terror that brought Reconstruction to an end in the 1870s across various states in the South. So take a moment, and I want you in the chat to tell me what you notice about this particular cartoon. More specifically, I do want you to focus on the paramilitary forces that are pictured here. And I'll give some time for responses in chat here as you're thinking a little bit and analyzing this image. We got one. Come on, don't be timid. I won't screen share it, so no one will see what you say. Great, got a couple more coming in. I'll give a few more minutes. Oh, great. All right, I'm gonna stop share while you're, please continue to type. All right. Yeah, in some cases here, we can see the costuming, some faceless terrorists, and then somebody whose face is exposed, but we certainly can't see it. A very frightening outcome to a noble cause, right? This is the reason why it's called worse than slavery. This idea that despite freedom and greater gains in citizenship, that terror was still something that was center in a lot of people's lives. The guns, certainly, we can see the weapons that are here. Standing over a family that's terrified, right? Terror. The skull and crossbones, right? As a really good point someone brought up, that we see this member of the White League and the KKK, as one of our guests, Rachel said, a militia-style force with the White League teaming up with the KKK, agreeing that the US was better with slavery. So yeah, a lot of you doing really well here, identifying two different groups. And I think that's really important because we do tend to sort of conflate all of these paramilitary or domestic terror groups as Klansmen, and that's just not necessarily the case. A lot of you pointing out the hidden masks. Yeah, that the so-called freed men and women and their child, right, are supposed to be free, but they still are oppressed. Nice job, everyone. So these are the groups that emerged really early in the late 1860s and early 1870s that began to terrorize, particularly families that had had economic gain, social gain. Sometimes jealousy was a factor here as well, and the loss of power. So I'm going to go back to screen share. And I'm going to launch our second poll here. I know we have a lot of South Carolinians here today, but I also know we have people from out of state. So I really want to know what your relationship is with the history of the red shirts. So I've got several options here. And I've given you the chance to do multiple choice in case you know that you've heard the narrative about red shirts from multiple places. So take a moment here and tell me what you know. I love all this participation. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm gonna give us another 15 seconds to get in that slice of pizza. Hurry back and vote. Great, a couple more people. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll. And let's share it and see what folks said. So a whopping 63% of you have never heard about the red shirts growing up. This was new information. And as we can see, and actually I'm a little bit surprised given our South Carolina audience here, that there's not more than one person here who maybe had a family member that participated in this. It was a huge organization and one in which was celebrated. So it was a story that was often shared. Some of you have learned about it on your own. Some in a museum, hopefully, one of our local institutions we'll be talking about today. An oral history from the community, right? It's so pervasive. And then some say, yeah, I don't know where I picked it up, but I did. And I'm really surprised that a lot of you did not think about hearing it memorialized in a public space. And we're going to talk a little more about that today. So what I want to do right now, I'm going to show you 4 slides of red shirts. I'll move through them a couple times, so don't worry if you weren't done analyzing one, I'll come back to it. So I have 4 slides coming up with red shirts, and I want you to type into the chat. Again, I won't share this, I'll stop screen share, what you are noticing about these shirts. All right, here we go. Many of these coming from the South Carolina State Museum, which you'll see me abbreviate from here on out as SCSM. This is the same shirt, by the way. All right, we'll come back. This one is a very well lit red shirt. And I feel pretty confident it's the one you're seeing on the right. Some things that I think people might miss in the image that are definitely noticeable in this space. The red shirt you see on the right is located in the Museum of the Reconstruction Era. And when you open it and kind of look closely, I've got some stains here. That's all I'm pointing out. Here we have another one from the State Museum. And yet another one in storage. All right, while you're finishing your thoughts, I'm going to backtrack back through these just in case there was something you wanted to pay a little more attention to. All right, I'm going to scroll back down through the 4, and then I'm going to stop share and take a look at your comments. Keep them coming. All right. 30 comments. I'm so excited to read all these. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling through here. Yeah, they're well worn, someone wrote. Somebody pointed out the initials, right? So this was someone's personal property, and they either wore it enough or took it with them enough, right? That there's an initial inside, or maybe there were multiple people in the family who had one. Some of these would have certainly been dyed, right? It's worn, suggesting that it was worn a lot, either in 1876 or worn a lot after 1876. Yeah, the letters HMR. Some of them are dressier, right? A dress shirt. Other folks also noticing how worn and the dyed by hand quality. Openings at the waistline, right? A line of them so you could put your suspenders through there, right? Buttonholes. It's well made, as someone's pointing out, right? Are men making their red shirts? Yeah, somebody pointing out it's really important that they kept them, right? That says something. This is a really great comment. Shirts for the entire family, the wife and the man and the children. It was worn at the time with pride. And then somebody's pointing out the red and gray one, right? There's one that has a lot more detail. Most looked well used. And I love this comment here. They're also not standardized, right? They look like people just sort of wore what they had. Really good observation. There's a military style. There is a kind of costuming here about it. Yeah, someone pointing out that one actually looks like a formal uniform, like perhaps you'd served in the Confederacy and you wanted something maybe resembling that. Maybe you could buy a red shirt from the new factories, right, that had been emerging in the 19th century. We don't quite have the textile industry yet in the South, but yeah, if you had the means, you could certainly buy this. Some were tailored. Absolutely. Great observations, everyone. And I think the point that you all really hammered home, right? These are made in different styles by people in the family. And I think a lot about this one because it looks elaborate to me. And it makes me wonder if it's somebody wealthier and if a domestic had to make this. And if you were a domestic in the 1870s in South Carolina, there was probably a good chance that you were Black. So imagine having to make this for what you know is going to be violence during the election. So some are fancier, there's a lot of variety. And what I'm hoping you really take away from this is the role that women and families played in this. We'd like to believe that this is just white men, but it is very much a family affair. All right, so now I'm going to launch our third and final poll for today. It's a simple yes or no question. If you went through K through 12 in South Carolina, did you use a history textbook written by or connected to Mary Sims Oliphant? She drafted the South Carolina textbooks that were used here between the 1930s and 1985. If you're from outside South Carolina, you might have had a similar text, particularly if you were in the South, that would have been reminiscent of the themes that Oliphant put in there. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. It's our last poll, half of you voted. Let's finish strong. So while folks are finishing this poll, just a note about Mary Sims Oliphant and how she felt about this particular period in time. She actually argued in these textbooks that the campaign was a family affair and it defined a good citizen. She bragged that women were complicit. They sewed the red shirts. They abandoned farm and businesses when there was a red shirt rally or parade. And she later removed this claim, and I quote, "Every decent white man went to work to deliver the state from its evil rulers." And this is what I think we can talk about building this generationally. There was also an exercise in this part of the textbook where students were invited to write a story about living during Reconstruction when their father took part. So there is this assumption, one, we see that these are segregated classrooms because the assumption is this is a white student and that their father participated in these events. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this poll. And we can still see quite a few of you, right, participating here today, grew up with these textbooks. And I imagine a lot of what you're hearing today either supports you learning new information that challenge this, but perhaps this is the first time you're hearing some of this information. All right, wonderful. I'm gonna stop sharing and see our last couple of comments here. Ooh, someone saying they didn't use them, but they found old copies. Yeah, same. I didn't grow up in South Carolina. I might have had one starting out, given my age, but I've read them. Yeah, so they're not that hard to find now. All right. So now I have another image. I don't know the exact year of this piece, but I do believe it's circa Reconstruction era, sometime between the Civil War and probably when Jim Crow really becomes cemented. This is a quilt by Louisa Housel. And so you're seeing the larger quilt to the right, and you're seeing a smaller close-up of the pattern. So once you kind of get over how beautiful the quilt is and its craftsmanship, let me know in the chat if you see anything within the pattern on the image on the left. For those maybe curious, Louisa lived in Lexington, so she would have been close to Columbia. I have a feeling now that we're seeing lots of comments here. Yeah, absolutely. It does look like sharp teeth too. But yeah, that's a Confederate flag. Absolutely. So she hand stitched this very subtle Confederate flag within this really beautiful quilt, and showing, right, how lost cause can develop over time. But what I want to kind of make clear is that cementing the lost cause, teaching it, and keeping it alive for 150 years was very much a family affair. So here are some images from the John May Museum. John May was actually in the South Carolina House of Representatives for about 20 years. He was also part of the Confederate War Centennial Commission in the mid-1960s, which is also the same time that he was a commander-in-chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He was actually their 50th commander-in-chief. And so being part of museums was also part of understanding the history of the red shirts and the lost cause. So whole families might come to this place, look at this memorabilia, these artifacts. And this is my particular favorite, right? Because we can see mom, or maybe an older sister. I guess it could be a babysitter, but I'm gonna assume it's mom, leaning over and really teaching, right, this young child about what he is seeing. So this really can't be done without the full family and women as part of the process. So I want you to take a look at this image, also from the South Carolina State Museum. This is a meeting of the red shirts in 1908 in Pendleton. And just what do you notice about this scene? Who is present? Give folks some time to. Oh, lots of good comments. Let's see what we've got. Give you about 10 more seconds. Oh my goodness, lots of comments. Okay, I'm gonna stop share and start reading some of these. Whole families. Women and children with ladies who lunch. Men, women, kids, absolutely. Oh, someone wanting to know who the red shirts are. Okay, so the red shirts, that's actually a really great question. The red shirts are the paramilitary force that brought an end to Reconstruction in the state of South Carolina in 1876. And you have similar groups that emerge across the South. Sometimes they're rifle clubs, and there were certainly rifle clubs in South Carolina as well that, that marched with and promoted violence with the red shirts. Although they technically end Reconstruction in South Carolina and bring back white democratic rule to the state, they end up going on to actually help other states overturn Reconstruction biracial democracy. The best example that I can think of is 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina, where we believe is the only coup d'etat in US history on the local level. It's the last bit of Reconstruction where a fusionist government had formed between Black and white, Black Republicans and white populists. And they were forced out of government. And the red shirts came up to North Carolina and actually helped with this massacre. The number is unknown of how many Black members of the community were killed, but it drove most of the Black middle class out of the community. A cannon, maybe? I thought I recognized the cannon too, perhaps. Definitely horses pulling something, right? Ooh, really great point. Parade best clothes. A variety of ages. Yeah, but a lot of people really talking about the outfits, right? And dressing up. All right. So now I want to actually show you, as my introduction stated, I'm very much interested in exhibit film. And so the same question applies here. What this is a red shirt parade in 1926 on the 50th anniversary of the end of Reconstruction in South Carolina. This is actually housed at the Moving Image Research Collection at the University of South Carolina, a wonderful resource. And it is part of an exhibit film at the Museum of Reconstruction, of the Reconstruction Era at Woodrow Wilson Family Home. And so I've just cut the part of it out of the exhibit film that's in one of the last spaces. I'm gonna turn off the audio because I think it can be distracting, but same question. How would you describe this scene? Who is present? And there's a lot happening here, so I'll play it for you again. It's a fascinating piece. I'm gonna do it one more time while we wait for a few more comments to come in. I'll take a look at them. All right, I'm gonna stop share. Lots of comments. Yes, it's a patriotic event. In fact, some people that have been in the museum have described it, like it looks like a 4th of July parade. We can see the monuments. Some of you who live in Columbia may have noticed the Wade Hampton statue that makes an appearance. For those of you who are not from South Carolina or Columbia, Wade Hampton is the man who's going to be governor in 1876. So the red shirts rode with him and for him, and he's commemorated on the State House grounds still today. There's a militaristic vibe, absolutely, right? There's marching. People have come back out in their red shirts. And someone else making this point, a very popular occasion as participants relive history to honor heroes. Yes, this was festive. She asked this. Yeah, absolutely. I think this was meant to be festive for the white families that are attending here. But they're white participants. We see a band. We see children. We see the State House Capitol in the background. But this is a celebration of domestic terror and violence 50 years after it actually took place. And I think as someone's pointing out, yes, you didn't have to be a Black Columbian in the crowd to be intimidated by this and know the power of what this parade meant. Just as the 1908, as Jim Crow is becoming cemented, it's just 13 years after South Carolina passes its new state constitution. Yeah, that would have been intimidating as well. Nice job, everyone. And so we can see the ways in which red shirts are commemorated in lots of different ways. Parades, in textbooks. There is even still a red shirt shrine in Edgefield, which also produced a lot of governors, particularly segregationist governors. I think Tillman was there. I'm pretty sure Tillman was from there, but I know definitely Strom Thurmond was. And supposedly this whole house is being preserved because General Martin Witherspoon Gary supposedly from the porch of this house, back it up here, urged red shirts to ride in the red shirt campaign, mobilizing them for General Hampton, who'd fought in the Civil War and was now running for governor. And supposedly there were 1,500 red shirts in the yard, and you can see the sort of generational or friendly nature, perhaps, of the red shirt movement. I'm not even sure, honestly, that this is still open. But about 5 years ago, the Thursday, Friday, Saturday times were not available, but I did happen to sneak in because the president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who runs the home, was there for a film shoot. And so she let me walk around. And the idea is that you go into the red shirt shrine, there's thousands of artifacts, and you find the 3 red shirts that they have preserved. So there are so many red shirts that have been preserved across the state. So one last issue before we kind of move into modern comparisons is the way in which we've commemorated white supremacist violence and paramilitary violence in the US. And so the most famous representation is The Birth of a Nation, which was so powerful that it reignited a nationwide plan. You can hear the exciting music there. So muting that for just a moment. What this film does is that it allows for groups like the Red Shirts to be lumped in together with the Klan for national consumption. But you can bet that when South Carolinians watch this film, and we know they attended in large numbers, they thought of the Red Shirts and other local rifle clubs. And so we don't have a lot of other films that depict Reconstruction. There's a handful. And one of the newer ones is Free State of Jones. Now, I'll be the first to confess this has a white savior vibe. So a warning if you've never seen it. And if you have, it is based actually on historian Victoria Bynum's book. And there's a really great website that Gary Ross created that will present primary source documents and artifacts so you can see what is historic and what is not. but you'll have to look really quickly. I cut part of the trailer, copyright issues here, but you'll see a really quick depiction of what would have been rifle clubs. But again, they kind of take on that ragtag Klan look. We get to the church, and there's a slightly longer clip of that within the movie during Reconstruction. But we're also not really naming these groups well in the various ways we talk and teach about Reconstruction. And so that brings me more into the present. So this part draws largely on the work of Kathleen Belew, who wrote a book called Bring the War Home. You maybe have seen her as a talking head on news programs. She's written a lot of op-eds since the January 6th siege. And she argues that our modern white supremacy and militia movement grew from and is framed by the Vietnam War. So it matured into an umbrella social movement, something new in the white supremacy movement, and it started to accept a wide range of white power symbols and ideology. That's why you'll sometimes see a Confederate flag and then a symbol related to a militia. And so these men that came home from Vietnam, it's a disparate group. They have different socioeconomic backgrounds. They have different education. Some are city, some are rural, but they are coalescing and they're united by a couple things: economic hardship, institutional distrust, which I think we continue to see today, and a growing culture war, which we certainly see today. And so this becomes a narrative of crisis and betrayal, very reminiscent of the way that white Southern Democrats during the Reconstruction era, military leaders and politicians, and people believed that they had been portrayed in the Vietnam War. So this coalition is rising above military defeat, and it's starting to embrace white militant masculinity. And by the 1980s, they shift gears. They're combining Cold War anti-communism with anti-Semitic rhetoric and racism that we know has always been a part of, say, that Klan revival in the 1920s. And you'll notice language you also hear today in some presses: globalist, non-white, elite, dominating government, media, and banking. And they begin to grow. And to give you a context, they're on the fringe, but they're bigger than the John Birch Society in the mid-20th century. And they take this turn in the 1980s where they start to see an apocalypse coming, where they want a state separate of the United States that's devoted to white supremacy. And this is when they begin to move to a cell-like structure that we tend to more think about with foreign terrorism and a leaderless strategy. And so this allows covert violence that is difficult to link to a larger movement and to any individual leader. As they continue to grow in the 1990s and metastasize, they become the size of the second Klan in the 1920s. So why don't you know about this, right? Well, you do know about the two incidents that prompt a federal response that certainly marks the crescendo of the movement. The first was Ruby Ridge, the standoff at the Weaver family's compound in Idaho in 1992. And that resulted in the death of an officer, the mother, and the child there. And then the other one is Waco, Texas, and the 76 Branch Davidians that died in the fire. And this angered specifically Timothy McVeigh and other like-minded militants. And it is Waco that inspires Timothy McVeigh to attack the Oklahoma City Federal Building, or the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. He's operating without leadership, but he's supported by other militia members, Terry Nichols, which is maybe a name you remember if you were alive then, and Michael Fortier. He ultimately kills 149 adults and 19 children who were at daycare in this bombing. And it's the largest mass casualty event between the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 and September 11th. But there's not a very strong response from the federal government. And that means that other groups operating in the same cell-like structure will see an opportunity in the future. And here you can see Timothy McVeigh at Waco. He was part of local Klan memberships when he was in the military and active at other white supremacist sites. So back to the red shirts for just a moment to give you context about how this connects. When a journalist went out to the Red Shirt Shrine not long before I visited there, he interviewed Elizabeth Reddy, who was the head of the UDC, that woman I met, this is the part-time museum director. And in 2014, she says this in the article, after seeing a bit of the red shirts in Clive Bundy's standoff with federal officials over grazing fees on public land, she speculated that, quote, pretty soon the red shirts are going to ride again, end quote. 2 years later, jurors acquitted Bundy's son and other militants of charges related to the occupation and standoff of that wildlife reserve in Oregon. And this is what Kathleen Belew would recognize as these activities that are leading up into the January 6th insurrection. The other issue I would argue that prevents us from having an adequate conversation about the road to January 6th is the way in which we commemorate domestic terror. This is actually the site of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. And this is Lynn Gest, who on the 25th anniversary of the bombing is visiting what is actually an isolated space on the site. This is for people who lost family members or loved ones, and they're the only ones allowed in this commemorative moment. And so sites like this, and even what we see in September 11th, recent sites tend to use these museums not to really process and learn from national trauma, but to present a comfort culture. That's why when you go to these sites, you might get a teddy bear or a snow globe. They have these mass-produced goods. And so what we see here is a cultural memory, tourism, consumerism, paranoia, kitsch, and security coming together that allows the public to not deeply invest in what the root causes of this are, but to think of a concept that Martika Sturken calls innocent victimhood. So we're not talking about the root causes, just sort of honoring the dead as innocent victims. And that's important, but it depoliticizes the event. And so we have this culture of innocence cemented by kitsch, but not really talking about the terror that leads to this. And by the time you assassinate, or not assassinate, but the time you, Timothy McVeigh is executed, you've sort of silenced the causes of this movement. So this brings me to contested elections, both of 1876 and today. And this is a straight Republican ticket from 1876. And I want you to think about what it would have been like to have to cast your vote for Republicans when you had red shirts and other paramilitary forces around you. I'm going to come back to Free State of Jones really, really quickly. We're not going to watch the whole clip, but I wanted, because again, this gives us a sense of what this might have been like. So this is election day. Again, this is kind of our white savior part, but this is maybe what you could have imagined this experience being like.
We like Republican tickets. We ain't got those yet. Just the Democrat tickets. We'll wait. Might be a pretty long wait. Let me explain something to you. These men are here to vote. And they mind dying a whole lot less than you do. Let's see if I can find any.
So there was lots of ways that this fraud worked, right? It could be you didn't get to vote, ballot boxes were stuffed, they were removed, plus just the sheer rifles being present would have been very intimidating. And so we come to today. And we start to see some comparisons emerge in January 6th and with the way in which we've commemorated Reconstruction. This is supposedly a scene from the South Carolina State House as depicted in Birth of a Nation. It's one of the most offensive scenes ever put on celluloid. And I'm gonna let it run here, but what we saw from people in the wake of January 6th was some comparisons to Richard Barnett putting his feet up here in Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office during the Capitol attack. And a lot of people recalled that it looked a bit like the scene you're gonna see coming up. I should also note this is one of the few scenes where you actually see Black actors in Birth of a Nation because there's no interaction with white women. So they're not using blackface, which was the standard. Taking shoes off, right? And even though this is the Capitol versus the State House here, people definitely noticed the connection here. But if we look at actual documentation from the period, here is the Republican Party waiting to find out the results of a contested election in 1876 with Wade Hampton. You can see it represented here, as well as the legislative discs they use. These are men that are educated, waiting for the news, well-dressed, speaking to one another, not at all the representation we've seen. So in closing, and I want to give some time for questions here for sure, and I can certainly linger if we get a bunch of questions. In 2020, the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the FBI, and a global hate watch group officially declared in 2020 that white domestic terror is the #1 threat to the United States. So these are groups that you've probably heard of, like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the state militias. A lot of these people showed up in Charlottesville in 2017. And to give you a context of how many of the groups there are, SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, identified 1,020 hate groups in 2018 before this even moved into the #1 national threat. And if you look at this image here, we can see paramilitary forces or well-trained militia believed moving through. So there were people that were trained on that day to make their way through that crowd and use the crowd for cover for actual insurrection. And bringing us back to the role of women, 14% of the arrests that were made related to the Capitol riot, according to recent data this month, were women. And neither the globe nor the United States pays attention to the role that women play in domestic terror and violence. And we know they drive cars, they fundraise, they develop lesson plans for their students. This is actually Jessica Watkins, an Oath Keeper, who seemed to be leading and giving instructions. From my neck of the woods, you can see who we called the Pink Hat Lady. Jenny Heinel is also from Pennsylvania. This is also not a Southern movement anymore, as these women become part of this larger process. So while I could do a really lovely closing, I'm not going to in the interest of time, but I wanna make sure we field some questions and I can connect this a little bit more to you as well. I am ready for questions.
Okay, as a reminder, you can enter your questions for Dr. Taylor in the Q&A box. There's an icon at the bottom of your screen. So we have a question from Katie Min, and I apologize, I'm mispronouncing your name, but she says, do you feel it is too soon to create a learning space at domestic terrorism sites, where the typical wait period for representing wartime history is 2 generations, if her memory serves?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know, but I think that Ballou's work is the first in what's going to become a systematic study of this movement, and particularly after January 6th, we're going to see far more attention to it. But you know, it kind of, and I'm thinking back, and it's not everyone as well. You know, there's a comment here in the chat that said, well, a lot of Black soldiers served in the war too. Obviously, yes, they're not going to get rounded up into these white supremacist groups in the same way, but they might know someone that has done that. But yeah, I think we're still, you know, they always say 25 years for history before you can get an adequate lens. So yeah, I think there's going to be more time to analyze and make this widely available.
Okay, we have a question from David Miller. Can you say more about the line that connects the red shirts with their modern imitators? Is there a direct cause and effect relation?
You know, I'm sure between those that are participating from Southern states probably have oral histories and stories from their family, and they can see a more direct line. For me, the big connections that I see here, one is the costuming, the family affair of it, the ways in which everyone is participating. but also the paramilitary aspect. They're training in military style. They're brandishing weapons as a form of intimidation. They don't believe, you know, I think this is the last line I was going to read to you, actually, that what we're seeing here, they mentioned also Stacey Abrams' voter mobilization. What we're seeing are a threat of Obama, his administration, greater Black participation and greater Black and Brown participation and government. All of these same sort of things, a period of fundamental change, are feeding into both 1876 and 2021. So you're not going to ever, we always say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. This is rhyming here. The other thing I would point out that's not always clear that I think you all brought up in the red shirt analysis, these are also not poor people. One of the stories that comes out during Reconstruction is that the red shirts and other groups like them were mob violence. They just came up from the poor masses. No, these are being directed from above, from wealthy people. And what we've seen from January 6th on is that, you know, politicians and politicians' wives, police forces were going up in droves, we're renting buses, right? This is backed by elite people and middle-class people as much as it is by someone that might be of a lower socioeconomic standing as well. So the Black electorate, Black political leaders, toxic racist rhetoric, extremist misinformation, economic decline, these are all similar things that happen in both periods. The big difference, I would argue, is the internet. And that's why you can radicalize people like Dylan Roof from the Charleston Massacre separate of these larger militias, because they're meeting each other online and they can be radicalized alone.
That actually answered the next question I was going to ask. Perfect.
It's everyone. And it's not just men. While the white masculinity, that toxic masculinity is part of it, the women are serving behind the scenes for sure.
Well, that actually also asks a question about women. Do you see a division of women involved? Some who are very aware of the movement and others who are unaware and believe they're being patriotic?
I think there are some women like Rachel Powell, the pink hat lady, or Jessica Watkins, who you saw with the Oath Keepers, who are active members. They've probably been to, I don't know this, but my guess is based on what we know about the women that participate, we know some women even own the paramilitary camps that these men train in, because maybe it's easier to put it in their name. So I think those women are part of the process for sure. I think there are plenty of other women that came to that rally with their Trump hats and their MAGA hats, and maybe as a girl vacation and had a manicure before and went out and didn't know the Capitol was going to get overtaken, and probably did wander in out of interest, stupidity, whatever you want to call it. So there would have been a blend. I don't for a second believe that these militias and paramilitary forces were not using this crowd as cover. So yeah, some are complicit, some are not as complicit, I would argue.
So going back to the question about is poverty a driver? And your answer was that it's also wealthy people. This person is asking, do you have any thoughts as to why it's often presented as just poor people then?
It if it just comes out of nowhere. But we know that they plan this for weeks and weeks and weeks, right? So that's part of the story here too. And I think that it's easier to dismiss it, and you can't find the leadership as much if you try to frame it this way. And even Donald Trump framed it that way, right? He's like, they look kind of low class. I assure you, everyone was represented there socioeconomically.
Okay. Here's a question. What do you think about the recent GOP reference to the Compromise of 1876 in a good light?
Someone doesn't know the Reconstruction history. No, and this ended up ruining Rutherford B. Hayes' career. He was always, you know, kind of considered the guy who got the job by default. Absolutely not. I think that's an attempt by certain members of the Republican Party to make it look like we've had a situation that's been contested, that it came together, that it was decided peacefully or with congressional support. And that's just simply not true. I mean, what was happening in 1876 was a trade-off, right? The Republican Party maintains power in exchange for the removal of the military from the last couple of states that still have Reconstruction. And these tend to be the states that have large Black populations. So it effectively ends Reconstruction when there's no federal response. The reason Mississippi falls early is because Grant will not respond to direct white supremacist violence anymore with the military. And once there's no military to keep people in check, groups like the Red Shirts are allowed to rule the day.
This is a question about chances of long-term impact, and I think it's referring to long-term impact of events like January 6th and similar. And he asks, what are the chances of long-term impact, and will the Supreme Court with its conservative majority tilt the scale as it did in the late 19th century? And obviously you're not a soothsayer, but as a historian, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, no, I think until we start to see something like a domestic terror watch list, which has been argued, I think, by some legislatures, it's going to be really hard to track. And until everybody really understands that these are cell-like structures and that they're organized, we're going to continue to see them as one-off events like Timothy McVeigh, like Dylan Roof, but they're not. They're part of a larger burgeoning system that's been here for 40 years. So I think you've got to start listening to SPLC, the FBI, even though the FBI, right, can work a lot of different sides here. I think they're accurate in what their data is telling them. So until you get the study and you get the authorization from Congress, they're going to continue. And I noticed one person in the chat had said, you know, where can I read more about January 6th? I really recommend you all Google Kathleen Belew. She's been everywhere. That's what I referenced in the book. And she'll tell you a lot more about this, like the book, The Turner Diaries, that inspires their actions. This is all part of a larger plan to intimidate Americans and make them think that their government is susceptible. So until those steps are taken, one of the things that Belew and other like-minded activists are calling for is actually closer oversight of our military, because that's where they're getting the militia training from. Those group of men that came up through that Capitol that you saw had specific training somewhere. If they were not military, they were trained by military. And with that, it makes this movement even more dangerous. And what Belew and other like-minded activists want to do is start really monitoring soldiers that are using white supremacist tattoos, music. We're seeing growing membership at groups like that are showing up at Charlottesville and these monuments, right, that are being contested on the South Carolina state grounds as well. Until we start regulating the military and seeing how white supremacy is infiltrating it and our police forces, it's going to be really hard to counteract the growth. And January 6th is just a culmination. If you think back to Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, those were Proud Boys. That was part of a larger plan to kidnap and hold trial. That also is really reminiscent of Reconstruction, almost the precursor to a lynch mob. So they have coordinated plans out there, and they're listening to one another.
Okay, we probably have time for a couple more questions. So if you have any, please go ahead and submit them.
Yeah, I'm happy to stick around.
This is a good one. Belew argues that Vietnam is central to the growth of the white power movement in the US. Given the prevalence of white supremacist leanings in specific segments of the military, do you believe that the Iraq War has a role to play in the larger timeline you're attempting to outline here?
Absolutely. Belew would argue yes. What we're seeing, probably this resurgence in the 90s, is also going to be fed by Iraq and Afghanistan. And so some of those same feelings that men came home with from Vietnam, not being appreciated, not knowing if the war is won or not, they're coming back with this. And keep in mind, some of these people are probably sons and daughters as well of this first generation. So I know Belew has specifically argued that we'll continue to see this, and we're kind of seeing that second generation.
This question asks, in addition to things that you've mentioned, is demographic population trend driving some of this, the idea that people of color are growing in this country?
Yeah, I think absolutely the way you're seeing both demographic changes and that in turn ties to constituencies is absolutely a factor. I mean, the reason radical Republicans, as they're called, could make these sweeping changes is because they had power and a political voting bloc and included Black voices. And when you do that, right, it complicates the two-party system. So absolutely. Everything from a backlash to Obama to growing participation from various groups. I mean, when you look at what There's a reason why I think Donald Trump mentioned Stacey Abrams in his speech at the rally that day, right? When you look at this collective organization and being able to turn to Georgia senators. I mean, I'm from the South. Imagining a Black senator and a Jewish senator from Georgia was not something, a year ago. I don't know that I would have believed it was possible. So yeah, the ways in which we're seeing voter mobilization is certainly a factor.
Okay, this is a great question too. What impact do you think teaching the real Reconstruction in schools today will have on today's children and youth and their likelihood of following or not following today's white supremacists and terrorists?
Yeah, until you can recognize the pattern, it's really hard to see it. And I think we have to talk about the pattern of white supremacy more. But, consequently, I think learning about Reconstruction also shows us, that these demographic changes we're seeing, that these voting blocks we're seeing have been a long time coming. There's been 150 years of suppression. And we're seeing a great, I don't know if it's the last gasp, but it is certainly a gasp at what now is no longer a biracial democracy, but right, that is full of lots of people beyond just Black and white that classified Reconstruction in the South primarily. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered that thoroughly. I kind of got off track a little bit. But yeah, I think it'll teach both white people what to recognize when they hear friends or they're on the internet. I think that's going to be important to stop the individual radicalization, but more importantly, to teach that this really is the first civil rights movement. And so, what happens mid-century, movements we see today with Black Lives Matter are building on the slow, hard-won gains of Reconstruction. And that it is unfinished. And if people don't realize that Reconstruction was a failure, not because it brought Black representation, but because it failed to reach its full potential, it's harder to see this long line of rights like, gaining the right to vote and better wages and seeing the connections between that. But I think you've got to talk to your families. Yes, I can teach in a museum, I can teach in a classroom, but the uncle, the nephew, the people that one-on-one, that might be radicalized or get into something like the QAnon conspiracies, the more you talk to the people around you, the less likely I think that they would be to succumb to that kind of ideology, someone that can challenge it.
So this is a question about sort of a reaction to some of this white domestic terrorism, about how are people countering that, particularly movements led by people of color?
Repeat that for me one more time.
So the question is it's asking really, how are people of color, quote, repelling the rebel movement? So I think how are people responding to white domestic terrorism or white supremacy in governments or in movements?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people to admit that we're a nation built on white supremacy. And a lot of it is once you accept that, you can begin to see patterns and you can begin to think about challenging it. And I think what concerns me is we put the onus so much on the Black and brown communities. And this is really something that I think has to be a white conversation, that we talk to our peers, to our families, to try to meet the challenge head on, right? The more we ignore these patterns, the longer history of it, the ways in which we try to conflate everything into the Klan, and that makes it some in the past hooded, when, just like the red shirts, people that stormed the Capitol were proud to show their face. And you have to make this kind of information less socially acceptable. 30 years ago, you couldn't walk in and call red shirts terrorists. Now you can. And so we have to build on that momentum, I think. And if we do that, we'll see more people, I think, joining other movements as well.
So I think building on your answer to that question, this is one that says, how do you suggest reaching those who are, quote, unreconstructed?
That I've been working on for a really long time within my own family, and talking to other people it's a hard conversation to have. And, you know, other people have different versions about how to go about it. Some people say you've got to cut those kind of people loose, toxic, make it clear that this is not acceptable behavior, even to the effect that, you know, I'm not going to speak to you anymore like family. That may not work in your particular case. It might just be taking a family member to a site that talks about Reconstruction and having a conversation with them that doesn't feel attacked or coerced. I think, you know, things like the op-eds we're seeing coming out are important, but I also think this kind of programming where we can come in and have a conversation, I'd actually recommend folks come for the session 2 and session 3, because one, we'll see what Black groups and organizations are working towards in the 20th century or the 21st century. And then on the third one, we can talk about some of the ways to do this. So I'm hoping that the third session in particular will give you even more tools and resources of how to have this kind of conversation. But it's not an easy one. And it's one I continue to have with my own family and even some old friends as I try to hopefully use my skills to bring them and their ideology into the 21st century.
Okay, this is a question.
Ooh, let me interrupt one more. Write your legislators, ask them to start, we need a database of this. That's the other thing if you want to take legal action. Absolutely write to your local representatives and say, you know, I would love to see a database and real study of white supremacy in this country. I'd love to see oversight in the military. These are the small tools that are in our larger arsenal that we can begin to chip away at the influence and the power.
No, this is my question though. Do you know any organizations or sort of models for that kind of thing that we can give people where they can?
I don't, but I will look it up because it's a really good question and try to share those. I will say, you know, if you want some real data, the testimony before Congress in 2020 will give you the information you need to talk to your family about just how pervasive hate groups are, the kind of violence that they get into. And those organizations, I would say, look to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I'm trying to remember, it's Heidi Bierich, Bierich. She's the head of the global one, and she's written a lot about modern white supremacy, particularly within the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and how they even became more radicalized in the 1990s, which is really hard to believe. They went from moderate to more radical. We'll discuss whether moderate's the appropriate word there another time. But she is also a leading expert. Those organizations have been testifying before Congress. They probably do have resources.
Okay, and then we have 2 questions that are actually asking a similar thing. The first one is, do you see a correlation between the call for a constitutional convention and state legislatures? I'm not sure correlation to what. And then what do you think is the relationship to open the Constitution and have a constitutional convention as the other questions?
I think that could be really great in South Carolina. I don't know if I'm understanding this exact question, but given that, you know, it's still the 1895 Constitution in South Carolina, which, you know, codified Jim Crow, and what Ben Tillman is famous for. Yeah, I think it would be great to redo them, honestly, but I don't pretend to know on a local level what that would take. In the meantime, I think, you know, we need to do also things like passing the John Lewis voter rights bill, things like that will cement constant political participation, because that's the other thing too. They're arguing what people have been calling the big lie, that this was fraud. No, real fraud is what you saw in 1876. That is not what we're seeing today.
Okay, that about brings us to the end of the questions. If anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to type them in.
I'm just going to scroll through, make sure there's.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Nothing here that I missed. And just back to the poverty, it's really about education, right? The more people know, the more people understand about their history, the less likely they are to get caught up. So, you know, you may not have the best school, but, you know, we've got some great museums in South Carolina that could help you teach children and family members about this. And I think that's a really great way, because there's artifacts, people can see them, just like you all did today, right? You were able to tease out, women are involved in this, children are involved in this is huge. the people in your life will be able to do the same thing. And that's kind of why I wanted to have that early part of this conversation, so you could think about the way to enter some of these spaces and use them to hopefully not just learn about Reconstruction, but also think a lot about what's been happening today and how to stop this kind of overt violence, maskless, armed vigilante violence.
This is a great last question to end on. It's talking about the discourse over education and the pushback against the teaching of certain subjects, particularly this idea, a concern over, quote, critical race theory. Do you believe these types of culture war conflicts signify tough challenges in the fight ahead to communicate a more accurate and arguably demoralizing narrative of our nation's history?
You know, for me, I feel, you know, all of these tools help us understand the world better. But the pushback against things like critical race theory are coming from people that have never engaged with things like critical race theory. So, you know, they couldn't define it, you know, much less, I think, have a really deep, meaningful conversation about this. But I do think we've seen, whether it is like the 1776 report, the backlash to the 1619 Project, the textbooks we talked about with Oliphant, there's a lot of forces here of indoctrination. And what I think you've seen in the last 40 years is a blowback against a more inclusive history that's being taught in the university and taking much, much longer to trickle down into our K through 12 education. And so they're battling it out until we decide that scholars are doing their job well and are expanding our knowledge base, that information can be consumed by K through 12, and it can, depending on the level. It's going to be really difficult to challenge these kinds of culture war debates over education. As long as you have textbooks being produced in Texas for K through 12, you're not going to have an authentic history being taught. And I would actually argue that that side's winning a bit. It's, you know, we've had these victories with 1619, but the fact that in 2020 we were having a 1776 report that said you can't talk about these things says how far we have to go and how many people continue to read those narratives you maybe read in Oliphant or similar textbooks that endure today. Have I written a book on Reconstruction? It's coming. This is actually from chapter 5, part of it. And I am hopefully getting the book proposal out this summer, and I hope it will be to you all very, very soon. So please keep a lookout for it.
In the meantime, where can people find out more about your work, Dr. Taylor, if they would like to?
Sure. All right. So I do have an article on the failed attempt to create the National Park Service's first Reconstruction site in Beaufort. That's available from the Journal of the Civil War Era. I co-authored that. So if you want to know about the nuts and bolts, the radicalization of the SCV, you can read about that in the article, Reconstructing Reconstruction. I also have a series of podcasts if you're into public art and maybe the weird things they tell us in Pittsburgh. That's available through the city government of Pittsburgh. And it's a GSI map, which is the first to kind of integrate information on public monuments and their relationship with communities. You can also read some strange blogs at Reconstructing Reconstruction on my WordPress blog. And I am finishing up an article actually about the way that we do kind of get overwhelmed by the Confederate iconography. We actually have a lot of white supremacist statues across the nation. And Pittsburgh recently took down one of Stephen Foster, who was seated above an enslaved person, Old Ned, supposedly the inspiration for that song, and that was removed. And so contextualizing really where the nation is in these monument debates. That'll be forthcoming soon. So I'll definitely try to share this information as it becomes available. And I hope this is not the last you're seeing me in a public forum in South Carolina.
Well, wonderful. Before I close this out, is there any last thoughts you want to leave anybody with, Dr. Taylor?
No, I'm just glad you all came today to have a conversation, to think about artifacts, think about their relationship with the present. I'm a public historian, and we believe that there's something to be learned in the current moment out of the past, and we like to make those connections between past and present. And that's what I tried to do for you today. This is a really hard conversation. It's a longer conversation. We could have talked about it for 2 hours, but I encourage you to read more, check out these op-eds. That are really, there's a great one by Don Polite and Melissa, who I think is here today. They had worked at the Woodrow Wilson Family Home, the Museum of Reconstruction. And they did a really nice job of talking about some of these artifacts as well and how they connect to the present. So there are authors out there writing about this right now. It's just taking some time to find those places. Follow me on Twitter. I'll share them with you as much as I can, for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. Thank you all for joining us tonight. As James mentioned in the start, this is the first of a 3-part series on our vulnerable democracy, past, present, and future, sponsored by Duquesne University, Historic Columbia, Richland Library, the South Carolina State Museum, the University of South Carolina Collaborative on Race, and the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. I've dropped some links in the chat, including a link to a reading list that Richland Library has put together, a link to Dr. Taylor's website she mentioned, Reconstructing Reconstruction, as well as a link to the South Carolina State Museum's page on this series where you can find out more about the next 2. Our next session is next Monday. It'll be on race and democracy, a roundtable moderated by Dr. Bobby Donaldson. And on the following Monday, May 10th, Dr. Jennifer Gunter with the Collaborative on Race will facilitate a democracy dialogue. So we encourage you to join us for sessions 2 and 3. And in the meantime, thank you so much and have a wonderful night.
And I'll be there. Come talk to me. We'll continue to hash this out. I'll be at them all.